Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media, while we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum. I remain in the underclass. Joan Patrice McSherry, historian and professor of political science at Long Island University, specializes in the study of Latin American politics and wrote the book Predatory States, which detailed American involvement in Operation Condor. Based on formerly secret CIA documents from 1976, in the 1960s and early 1970s, plans were developed among international security officials at the U.S. Army School of the Americas and the Conference of American Armies to deal with perceived threats in South America from political dissidents, McSherry claims. The story goes, a declassified CIA document dated June 23, 1976, explains that in early 1974, security officials from Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia met in Buenos Aires to prepare coordinated actions against subversive targets. American journalist Arthur John Langeth states in a 1978 book that the organization of the first meetings between Argentinian and Uruguayan security officials concerning the surveillance and subsequent disappearance or assassination of political refugees in these countries can be attributed to coordination by the CIA, and that the CIA also acted as an intermediary in meetings between Argentinian, Brazilian, and Uruguayan death squads. Founded by the Pinochet regime in November 1975, Operation Condor was the code name for a formal Southern Cone collaboration that included transnational secret intelligence activities, kidnapping, torture, disappearance, and assassination, based on the National Security Archive's documentary evidence from U.S., Paraguayan, Argentine, and Chilean files. The Center for Justice and Accountability reported that the archives of terror documents list over 50,000 killed, 30,000 disappeared, and 400,000 imprisoned as a direct result of Operation Condor. But due to its clandestine nature, more likely than not, a precise and definitive conclusion will never be determined. In the aftermath of World War II and the fall of the Third Reich, thousands of prominent Nazis fled Europe using sophisticated covert systems of escape routes known as rat lines, developed by the Vatican with the support of the Catholic clergy, as well as the United States intelligence officers who utilized existing rat lines to move certain Nazi strategists and scientists to safe havens, primarily located in South America. According to German news publication Deutsche Welle, many Nazis who escaped via the rat lines followed a similar path across the Alps to Italy. Once in Italy, many Nazis followed the monastery route, which allowed them to hide out in local monasteries. Most then traveled to Rome, where they were assisted further, sometimes by American and British spies, and sometimes by prominent members of the Catholic Church. Today, we remain vigilant in our staunch obligation to challenge the prevailing narrative. Yet another tale of historical revisionism, intrinsically conflicting with the duplicitous version of recorded history. It's time we remove the veil and bear witness to the nefarious nature of the permanent war state. No longer can we afford to embrace this false reality. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote so long ago in his essay titled History in 1841, time dissipates to shining ether the solid angularity of facts. No anchor, no cable, no fences avail to keep a fact a fact. Babylon and Troy and even early Rome are passing already into fiction. The Garden of Eden, The sun standing still in Gibeon, its poetry thenceforward to all nations. Who cares what the fact was, when we have thus made a constellation of it to hang in heaven an immortal sign? London, Paris, and New York must go the same way. What is history, said Napoleon, but a fable agreed upon?
This is Eric Zott's first visit to Berlin in years, a trip in decades past he would not have been free to embark on. His time trapped in the infamous Colonia Dignidad cult has left him traumatized, not least because of the torture he was subjected to.
Colonia Dignidad remains something that I can never forget. Attitudes towards it have improved today, as has the will to investigate what happened. But the experience is there and will stay forever.
Zott was among those who openly challenged Chilean leader Augusto Pinochet. Critics of the dictator were swiftly rounded up, and Colonia Dignidad was among the regime's torture centers where they were held. The commune had been founded by German immigrants in 1961. The cult's leader, Paul Schäfer, brainwashed adults and sexually abused their children. Isolated from the rest of Chile, the inhabitants were essentially reduced to slave labor, while the colony's basement saw appalling atrocities.
Electroshock ohne Ende.
The electric shocks never ended, and for a long time without them even asking questions. I suppose the point was to break any last remaining emotional or physical resistance.
Eric Zott came to Berlin last week at the invitation of the German government, together with other victims. Many of them accused the authorities of West Germany and then unified Germany of turning a blind eye to the reports about Colonia Dignidad. German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier has acknowledged that mistakes were made.
The embassy failed to insist that German nationals, which the majority of Colonia's residents were, be allowed to speak to consular officials. The Foreign Office and the embassy lost their way in a conflict of interests, maintaining sound relations with the host country and protecting human rights.
Not the apology victims had been hoping for. But the German government will now be declassifying files on the colony. Eric Zott is happy to see Berlin now taking these steps.
I value what the minister said. I think it's a new start on this front.
Not all of the victims invited to Berlin see things that way, however.
What's missing is an undertaking to compensate us. I left the colony a decade ago, and we're still waiting.
And they're waiting for the perpetrators to be punished. Hartmut Hopp was Paul Schäfer's number 2 in Colonia Dignidad. Also head of the hospital, he's said to have used psychiatric drugs to pacify residents. In 2011, the Chilean authorities sentenced Hopp to 5 years in prison for aiding and abetting the sexual abuse of minors. But he'd already fled the country for Germany. His citizenship here has protected him from extradition so far.
There's been very little progress in terms of prosecutions in Chile, and practically nothing in Germany. Some of the perpetrators of Colonia Dignidad are fugitives who have been sentenced in Chile. People like Hartmut Hopp have fled to Germany to escape justice, while investigators here are not doing enough, in my opinion.
Born in Chile, Eric Zott now lives in Austria. His entire time in Colonia was as a prisoner of the Chilean secret police. The least he hopes for is that one of the culprits from back then shows remorse. Colonia Dignidad is now known as Villa Baviera, and that rebranding as a Bavarian village includes bizarre attempts to attract tourists, with events including a Munich-style beer festival. The colony is currently home to around 150 people, with perpetrators and victims living as next-door neighbours. Nothing, neither a museum nor even a commemorative plaque, now reminds visitors of the horrors this place witnessed.
Our story begins February 10th, 1980, when the Washington Post published an article with the title, Colonia Dignidad. Nobody comes, nobody goes. Mystery veils colony in Chile, wherein investigative journalist Charles Kraus describes, deep in the foothills of the snow-covered Chilean Andes, about an hour's drive from a small provincial town in southern Chile, some 300 West German citizens live an austere and regimented life behind the locked gates and barbed wire fences of a secretive agricultural commune named Colonia Dignidad. They are the followers of a charismatic, reclusive, and authoritarian spiritual leader named Paul Schaefer, who brought them here in 1961 from Siegburg, a town near Bonn. When I read about Jim Jones, I thought immediately of the Colonia Dignidad, said a diplomat in Santiago, 200 miles to the north, whose embassy has had some contact with the colony over the years. We know there is strong indoctrination, but we don't know if there's total intimidation. What is known about Colonia Dignidad, which jealously guards its privacy and has been remarkably successful in avoiding official inquiries, is frighteningly similar to what was known about Jonestown in Guyana before Congressman Leo Ryan's fateful trip. Dignity Colony, a spiritual experiment in communal living, or a front for torture by Chile's secret police. A retreat from the pressures of modern European life, or a fenced, guarded, secretive hideout for Nazis on the run. An idyllic effort to achieve a self-sustaining existence, or a horror house of political degeneration and sexual perversion. People who live there fiercely reject outsiders, leading to widespread speculation about what is going on in the colony, and they appear to have the help of the Chilean government in doing so. Nevertheless, through diplomatic sources, rare newspaper investigations, the recollections of the few outsiders who enter the place, and the accounts of escapees, it is possible to portray a closed society where all is not as its leaders would have outsiders believe. In Colonia Dignidad, according to this composite portrait, children are separated from their parents, and husbands often must live apart from their wives. Normal sexual activity, smoking, drinking, and contact with relatives outside the colony, which claims to be a socialist agricultural commune dedicated to charitable good works, is strictly prohibited. The West German government regularly receives letters from relatives of those living in the colony, saying their family members are being held against their will. The West German embassy in Santiago interviews those named in the letters. Neither it nor the Chilean government has ever made a serious attempt to determine whether the colony is, in effect, a concentration camp. Schaefer, a one-eyed former Nazi Air Force officer who founded the group after World War II, offered to take care of the spiritual and material needs of the simple farmers who joined in return for absolute loyalty. By all accounts, he seems to have total control over the colony, and its followers are said to work long hours in Dignidad's workshops, stone quarry, or fields, where they are watched over by supervisors who appear to have the function of guards, according to two sources. One Chilean government official who visited Dignidad some years ago said he saw several of these supervisors carrying pistols, and was also struck by the fact that specially trained German Shepherd dogs accompany teams of the colony's members when they work in far-off fields. In 1966, 3 members of the colony managed to escape, charging that they had been drugged, physically and sexually abused, and held in small cells because Schaefer considered them troublemakers who wanted to return to Germany. Wolfgang Müller, then 20, charged that he and other young men in the colony had been required to have homosexual relations with Schaefer, who left Siegburg with his followers almost 20 years ago. In Chile, Colonia Dignidad began to adopt Chilean orphans who are given German names and are educated in the colony's own schools. They, like other members of the colony, are seldom allowed to leave what several sources describe as a vast 15,000-acre farm, which is ringed by sturdy barbed wire fences, has its own internal and external communication system, an 80-bed hospital, power plant, airport, airplanes, modern farm machinery, and reportedly an underground reinforced concrete bunker with what's been described as a maze of stone-walled tunnels beneath the enclave, leading to other charges about what goes on there. The colony continues to maintain a mother house in Siegburg, which raises money from a group of partners for the commune here in Chile. It also has a mansion filled with electronic communications equipment in Santiago. The house has high walls and an unlisted telephone, something that is normally prohibited by Chile's military government. Neighbors recently said that they have never had any contact with those living inside the headquarters. Colonia Dignidad has instituted a libel suit against the West German branch of Amnesty International after the organization alleged that torture occurred at the colony. In 1975, Amnesty published a 60-page pamphlet entitled Colonia Dignidad, German Model Farm in Chile, Torture Center of the Dinah. The pamphlet charged that the remote colony had been used as an experimental torture center and prison camp by Chile's secret police after the country's 1973 military coup. There have also been charges over the years that the colony is a way station in the South American Nazi underground where war criminals wanted by German, Israeli, or other authorities are allowed to hide. A Chilean who visited the colony several years ago said that he was told by Ursula, a nurse in the colony's ultra-modern hospital, that doctors there were expert in performing plastic surgery. Last December, Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal said that he had evidence that Joseph Mengele, the Third Reich's infamous Angel of Death, had lived in the colony for a time last year. The FBI had similar information. A spokesman for the colony, Hermann Schmidt, vehemently denied in a letter to El Mercurio, Chile's most important newspaper, that Mengele or any other Nazi had ever lived in the colony. Rather than open its doors to disprove such charges, however, Colonia Dignidad has, if anything, become more closed and self-isolated since 3 of its members escaped 14 years ago. In addition to the UN Human Rights Commission, 2 members of the West German Bundestag, the German federal parliament, were denied entrance in 1978. Journalists are regularly refused entry to the colony, and several have been arrested at its gates. Many Chileans, as well as diplomatic observers with an interest in the colony, say that it is virtually a state within a state, which has been protected over the years by successive Chilean governments, either because of the country's influential German community, which contains many Nazi sympathizers, or because of the colony's political affinity for the current right-wing military government. Those familiar with the colony point out that with its airstrip, private communications system, and proximity to the Argentine border, it would not be difficult for someone to enter the colony, live there, and leave without ever going through customs formalities. Only the most trusted members of the colony are allowed to leave, and then apparently only in groups. Only carefully selected outsiders are allowed inside its well-protected perimeter, and then only for prearranged visits. Chilean peasants from the surrounding area who hold the colony in high regard are given free medical care in its hospital, but only during certain pre-established hours. One Chilean who spent 3 nights there said he had uncovered microphones hidden in his room, which his host then explained were there to anticipate his needs. He also said he was followed wherever he went and was not allowed to have spontaneous contact with members of the sect. Much of what is publicly known about Colonia Dignidad was uncovered by Ursula magazine, which wrote about the 1966 scandal in detail, and El Mercurio's Sunday magazine, which had been allowed to send a reporter to visit the colony in 1977, about the same time Dignidad's libel suit against Amnesty International was filed in West Germany. According to El Mercurio, the colony's central village is composed of German-style buildings from another era. The men dress in plain, old-fashioned clothes, and the women in long, flowery dresses with aprons, similar to the garb worn by the Trapp family children in The Sound of Music. The colony's leaders also said that the children live apart from their parents for educational purposes, and because their parents have to work. Men and women live apart because, it was claimed, there had not yet been time to build separate living units for each family. The colony has its own electric generating plant, internal telephone system, and school. There is no church. Whatever religious affiliation or basis the group might once have had in West Germany seems to have disappeared since it was transplanted to Chile. No one knows who is behind the central organization in Siegburg, which has poured millions of dollars into the colony over the years, one diplomatic observer here said. The religious and social aims of this group are very uncertain. It is all very strange. There is little more that can be said with certainty. As Mathilde Schergelis, a member of the colony, wrote to her mother in Germany 10 years ago, "Nobody is getting in here, and nobody is getting out." Economist and researcher Hans Stella from the Chile Latin America Research and Documentation Center in Berlin offers a comprehensive overview in the form of Colonia Dignidad, a transnational case of human rights violations and its economic dimensions in the past and present, explaining that Paul Schaefer was born in Bonn on December 4, 1921. He was the third son of Anna Schmidt from Trostav. His father, Jacob Schaefer, disappeared after the divorce from his mother in 1932. Paul Schaefer was 10 years old at that time. The mother remarried in 1933. According to Schaefer, his father died in the war, as did his two older brothers, Walter and Hans. At the age of 6, Paul Schaefer severely injured his eye, and from then on wore a glass eye. He had to repeat 2 grades, and in 1936, at the age of 14, he left school after the 6th grade without graduating. His former schoolmate, Willie George, reports, "We served 2 masters in the early days. We were obliged to participate in the Hitler Youth, but on the other hand, we kept faithfully to our youth group, which was affiliated with the Protestant Eichenkreuz." Schaefer, according to George, rejected the Hitler Youth, but was not persecuted for it. At the age of 18, Schaefer moved to Siegburg near Cologne. In October 1940, he was called up for a few months for the Reich Labor Service in Aachen. Due to his eye injury, he was not deployed to the front. On February 6, 1941, he was drafted for military service and stationed in Munster, presumably as a medic. Due to the sparse information about Schaefer's role during the Second World War, there were later various speculations about his involvement in National Socialist crimes. Specifically mentioned were possible assignments in forced labor camps of the Duniment Aktiengesellschaft in Trostav, and a subcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp of Hassag in Meuselwitz. It appears that Schaefer did not complete any professional training or have any academic degrees. After the war, Schaefer is said to have been largely unemployed. He was without a residence record and lived in the apartment of his mother and stepfather. In 1946, Paul Schaefer took over the leadership of boys' groups of the Protestant Youth Torstav on a voluntary basis. In the early 1950s, he was employed at several youth homes the Protestant Church ran. Each of these employments ended in dismissal after criticism of his educational methods had become loud. There were repeated indications of sexual abuse of young people entrusted to his care. After his dismissals, Schaefer continued to run his youth groups autonomously. His appeal seemed so strong that many young people defied their parents' prohibitions and the criticism of church congregations to continue belonging to Schaeffer's groups. From year to year, Schaeffer expanded the number of his followers by preaching at various locations. He sent out newsletters at regular intervals and organized annual camps, which played an important role in forming his community. In addition to personal confessions, Schaeffer also required group members to give him their confessions in writing and implemented a sophisticated technical monitoring system, bugging the private conversations of group members and tapping the telephone system. Group members were spied on and eventually held publicly accountable for what they said. Violations of Schaeffer's ideas of morality, obedience, and discipline led to severe corporal punishment, which in most cases was carried out by other leading figures of the group. Romantic or sexual encounters were described by Schaeffer as carnality, Fleischeslust, and devil's stuff, Teufelszeug, and punished with draconian measures. Already in those years, young people were cast out the devil, as Schaeffer called it, with drugs and electric shocks. Psychotropic drugs were used to break the individual willpower. In addition, there were ritual orgies of beating, in which several people talked or shouted at the person to be punished and then beat him or her for minutes. Schaeffer also ordered fasting for several days as a punishment mechanism. Schaeffer's relationship with women was dominated by misogyny. He treated women condescendingly and kept them out of most decision-making structures unless it was to his benefit. In June 1956, the group consolidated decisively. Schaeffer convened a brothers' conference in Mönchengladbach, where he outlined the rules and structures of the community. The gentlemen and the single sisters, he spoke about biblical communities of life. All who are willing to give up their personal lives and give their labor and earned money to the community are to be called cross carriers and are the supporting pillar of the community. So-called cross carriers worked for free. The other group followers paid a tithe into the treasury, which Alfred Schack administered. Thus, the group quickly stood on solid financial grounds and built an appropriate infrastructure. The procedure for incorporating new members was harsh. If, for example, a spouse did not want to become part of the group, divorce was forced. Supposed religious reasons were cited, and the community leadership did not shy away from criminal methods, as they were later developed in Chile. Already at the beginning of 1956, Schaeffer had called 12 of his most trusted followers to him and told them of his plan to create a permanent place for the group. He proposed to contribute a whole year's income to enable the money to buy a house, and at the same time said that should anyone who wished to leave the group, they would not be entitled to a refund of the contribution. He presented a pre-written letter that was signed by everyone. Schaeffer later transferred to Colonia Dignidad this idea of the group as a community of property to which all members contribute their work and assets. Some members transferred their entire wages to an account for which Schack was authorized to dispose. In August 1956, the group's first members moved to Heide-Lomar in the Rhine-Sieg district of North Rhine-Westphalia. Here, the group acquired a plot of land, cleared the swamp area, demolished an old wooden barrack, and began building a youth home, which was completed in 1959. Meanwhile, at the same time, around 200 people had already donated to the building project. The association Private Social Mission, PSM, was founded as the official sponsor of the construction project. Schaeffer's demeanor was imperious, self-righteous, and egocentric, his tone rough and vulgar. Although this contradicted the strict, prudish, and chaste discourse of free church circles, Schaeffer was able to convince his followers of his supposed closeness to God, which gave him, as the only member of the group, an aura of infallibility. Already during these years, Schaeffer conceived a system that would perfect his rule over the group and ensure his access to victims for his sexual crimes. Through his pseudo-religious discourse, he legitimized the breaking up of family structures, as well as any structures of trust based on familial or friendly bonds. Members of the group were urged to transfer custody of their children to leaders and to abandon the children to home education. From today's perspective, this transfer of custody of the group's children appears as a planned act within a system that aimed to ensure the availability of boys for the permanent commission of his sexual crimes. The children were systematically alienated from their parents and therefore at Schaefer's mercy without protection. Family structures were shattered by transferring custody to other group members. In this way, Schaefer pursued the goal of being able to exercise control over every individual in the group himself. The religious aspect turned out to be more and more of a cover. People who opposed Schaefer in the group were harassed with libel suits. This procedure was perfected and used massively throughout Colonia Dignidad's existence. The group's opponents were thus silenced, and simultaneously, the group's supporters remained convinced of the group's clean slate. Another of Colonia Dignidad's strategies dates back to the group's founding days: publicity-focused staging of festivities. Guests were courted to gain supporters, and the group's social commitment was presented to them. On September 23, 1960, the youth home in Heide Lomar was officially inaugurated with a celebration. Local personalities were invited, in addition to Federal President Heinrich Lübke. The latter sent his apologies. However, as a representative of the federal government, Dr. Friesig, from the Federal Ministry for Family and Youth, took part in the celebration. In the summer of 1960, Barr, Schmidt, and Schaefer traveled to Spain, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and Turkey for several months. According to Barr, the purpose of the trip was to learn about social conditions and orphan work. Presumably, the trip was intended to explore immigration. Due to the increasing publicity of Schaefer's acts of abuse, prosecution had become more and more likely. To his followers, Schaefer now talked openly about his plans to leave the country, justifying them with the fear of an invasion by the Soviets. According to Wolfgang Müller, now known as Wolfgang Nies, Schaefer preached one day that he had had a dream. In his dream, the Russian troops had poured over the border into West Germany. He said, but to save us, we had to get out of Germany. Together with Hermann Schmidt, Schaefer traveled to Chile on January 3, 1961, arriving the following day. On January 27th, Hermann Altevogt reported Paul Schaefer for sexual abuse. As a result, the district court in Siegburg issued a warrant for Schaefer's arrest on February 21, 1961. They then traveled once again from Chile to Brussels. A group of children whom he had abused in Heide Lomar were brought to him and instructed to deny Schaefer's actions in case they were questioned by investigators. Heinz Kuhn, who was also present at this meeting, was instructed by Schaefer to burn the group's so-called pastoral files, that is, the written confessions of sin that Schaefer had always demanded, which the latter then did. Meanwhile, Schaefer's confidants prepared the group's departure for Chile. The fact that the South American country was chosen can be explained by the connections of the group's leadership to the Chilean ambassador in the FRG, Arturo Maschke, and to the Chilean consul, Guillermo Osorio. The contact is said to have come about when craftsmen from the group were carrying out repair work at the Chilean embassy in Bonn. The ambassador and some of his associates are said to have then visited the youth home in Heide Lomar several times and recommended that the group's social work be extended to Chile. The group justified the choice of Chile by the severe earthquake in the south of the country on May 22, 1960. In Chile, they argued they wanted to support children who had lost their parents in the quake. Between 1961 and 1963, about 250 group members immigrated to Chile, most of them by ship. According to the Torture Colony, an essay published in the American Scholar on September 1, 2008, Colonia Dignidad perpetuated itself through a complex system of social controls. They thought of themselves as an extended family based not on blood, but on absolute devotion to Schaefer. They called him permanent uncle. Schaefer himself had selected the title and drilled into his disciples a definition of family he found in the Bible. "Who are my mother and father?" he liked to say. "Those that do the work of God." People were divided into groups by age and gender, each with its own flag and insignia. A boy born inside the Colonia would spend the first years of his life not with his parents, who themselves lived apart from each other, but with nurses in the hospital, one of the babies. At 6, he would graduate to a group called the Wedges, and from there, at 15, to the Army of Salvation. By his mid-30s, he would become one of the elder servants, a status he would retain until at 50, he was ready to join the Kamalos, a term that has no obvious meaning. Girls progressed through a similar series of groups, including the Dragons, the Field Mice, the Women's Group, and the Grannies. They may have come to Chile for their religion, but once there, they became prey to a brutal and relentless cult of personality. Dr. Niels Biderman, a Chilean psychiatrist who, in association with the German embassy, had been making monthly trips to Colonia Dignidad to study the psychology of its inhabitants, offered observations from his work. The older colonos punished the younger ones under orders from Schaefer, Biderman said. They were also the ones who were supposed to educate them. This involved keeping them away from their families, keeping them active all day, and principally keeping them obedient and disciplined. They did whatever they needed to do, including psychopharmacology and electroshock. Allegations of much more extreme methods of torture would later surface, including forced injections of sodium pentothal, removed corneas, and even inserting electrodes into children's genitals, leaving many of them infertile. German doctor Gisela Seewald admitted that she used electroshock treatment and sedatives on children who refused to obey Colonia Dignidad's hierarchy as director of the Enclave's hospital from 1975 to 1978. The treatments were also applied to children who resisted the sexual advances of colony founder Paul Schaefer, the doctor told Chilean Judge Jorge Zepeda in her public confession. Over time, physical coercion became less necessary as the social system became rooted in the psyche of the individual. The outer perimeter of Colonia Dignidad was marked by 8-foot fences topped with barbed wire, which armed groups of men patrolled day and night with German Shepherd and Doberman attack dogs. Guards in observation posts equipped with shortwave radios, telephones, binoculars, night vision equipment, and telephoto cameras scanned the landscape for intruders. If invaders were to succeed in getting through the perimeter, they would come upon a second tier of inner defenses, strands of copper wire hidden around the village, which, if stepped on, triggered a silent alarm. Doors and windows in most buildings were equipped with armored shades that could be drawn shut in the event of an invasion. Dormitories were outfitted with alarms and surveillance cameras, and the entire village sat atop an extensive network of tunnels and underground bunkers. When the alarm sounded, as it frequently did during practice drills, men belonging to the security force grabbed their rifles and waited on their doorsteps for instructions. It's hard not to notice the eerie similarities between Jim Jones's People's Temple agricultural project in Guyana and Paul Schaefer's commune in Colonia Dignidad. Author and researcher John Collins claims that few people are aware that the groups were related through the period of history that began during Jim Jones's early faith-healing ministry. Both groups are not so distant cousins through the intersection of Jim Jones and William Branham. Though Schaefer's political and ideological views formed in West Germany, They were seeded with bias towards a political and religious belief system that originated from Indiana during the post-World War II healing revival of the 1940s and 1950s through the worldwide evangelistic ministry of William Branham, the same evangelist who kick-started Jim Jones's ministry in Indianapolis, Indiana. In the years leading up to the healing revival, Indiana was a state torn by the political unrest created by the Ku Klux Klan, a terroristic organization that had been revived on Stone Mountain in Georgia in 1915. Indiana's capital of Indianapolis, where Jim Jones's People's Temple originated, was once the site of the National Ku Klux Klan office. Klan meetings with high-ranking Klan members attending were held at the Cadle Tabernacle, where Jim Jones and William Branham also held one of their joint healing meetings, and Branham himself was initiated into the Pentecostal faith by official Klan spokesman and later Imperial Grand Dragon Roy Davis. Though Jones himself never openly supported the Klan's views on white supremacy, it can be argued that the Klan's influence in the state of Indiana and the men with whom Jones associated were contributing factors in the tragedy to come. In fact, some research suggests a significant correlation between the racism of Indiana and motivation to join the People's Temple. Interestingly, Schaeffer, who was the leader of a Branham-inspired religious sect until his death, received the same influences through the recorded sermons and transcripts of William Branham that were produced from 1947 to 1965 and redistributed from a distribution center in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Since his death in 1965, many of his 1,205 recordings have been translated into 70 languages and sent to countries around the world, while children are currently being indoctrinated with his teachings. The healing revival itself coincided with the Second Red Scare of 1947 to 1957, and some revivalists of that era claimed to have prophetic insight into what they considered to be the impending destruction of the United States. The state of Indiana, heavily impacted by the propaganda of the Ku Klux Klan and its anti-communist speeches and literature, held crowds of people eager to hear any extraordinary insight into the turmoil ahead. 2 years prior to the Jones-Branham revival at the Cadle Tabernacle, William Branham began proclaiming the first of several of his doomsday predictions, claiming that 1954 was the year of destruction. Only 2 months prior to their revival, Branham updated his prediction to 1956 as the final year for America to accept his version of the gospel. This prediction came with emphasis on his claim of a prophetic vision describing communist Russia's bombing northern Kentucky and southern Indiana. His doomsday predictions appear to have finally made an influence on Jim Jones by 1961. Jones himself began claiming prophetic vision of the same bombing. In November of 1961, Branham claimed that great men around the world were predicting that the first bomb from Russia would drop in Louisville, Kentucky, a mile from the Indiana border. Around the same time in the fall of 1961, Jim Jones began claiming to have had a prophetic vision of Indianapolis being consumed in a nuclear holocaust. Branham's prediction of nuclear Armageddon that directly shaped Jim Jones's religious and political ideology also influenced Paul Schaeffer through the worldwide spreading of Branham's religious cult following called The Message. Although Schaeffer would not be largely affected by the bombing of Indiana, Branham's doomsday predictions also included the destruction of Germany. The impact of the predictions upon Jones and Schaeffer were virtually simultaneous. In 1961, the same year of the Branham-Jones revival at the Cadle Tabernacle in Indianapolis, Branham traveled to Karlsruhe, Germany, and held a similar campaign of meetings in the fading healing revival. By the end of that year, Jim Jones had fled America for the first time, mysteriously traveling to Guyana, South America, when ministers Schaeffer and Barr had departed Germany with 70 members of his sect of Branham's Message cult to Chile, South America, to found Colonia Dignidad. Jonathan Franklin in Santiago penned an article for The Guardian Monday, October 11th, 1999, in a special report regarding Pinochet on trial. The headline reads, "Files show Chilean blood on U.S. hands. Clinton accused of protecting darkest of the CIA's secrets." The article delineates how the U.S. government released more than 1,100 previously classified documents from the CIA, Defense and State Department archives, which detail efforts to provoke violent protests and economic chaos in Chile as part of U.S. efforts to destabilize the regime of President Salvador Allende. The heavily censored files released on Friday are just a fraction of those compiled in 1968 to 73, when the U.S. waged a secret campaign to undermine Allende, a Marxist who wanted to nationalize foreign businesses, including U.S. copper interests. Human rights activists and Chileans whose relatives died in the bloody aftermath of the 1973 coup have protested that damning policy papers have been withheld or so censored that they reveal nothing new. Many of the U.S. activities before and after the coup in which General Augusto Pinochet took power were uncovered and widely publicized by the 1976 Church Report of a Senate investigation into U.S. involvement in Chile. The latest documents were released as part of a project begun by the Clinton administration after Pinochet was arrested in London a year ago. President Clinton has ordered the National Security Council to review and declassify secret U.S.-Chile files to assist the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón, who applied for Pinochet's extradition to Spain on torture charges. A report by the Chilean government says 3,197 people died or disappeared at the hands of secret police during Pinochet's 17-year rule. The declassification allows the U.S. to help Mr. Garzón and makes it less likely that an international court will be established to judge the issue. U.S. involvement in Allende's downfall is widely known, but the extent of U.S. aid to the coup plotters is not. Chile was seen by the then President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger as a potential second Cuba. They decided, in the words of one cabinet member, to make the Chilean economy scream. Strikes by lorry drivers, financed by the U.S., paralyzed distribution, ratcheted up the sense of chaos, and forced Chileans to queue for petrol, food, and medical treatment. The released documents confirm that the U.S. was providing weapons as well as funds to the saboteurs. Some of them have been heavily censored, including those about the murder of René Schneider, commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, which nevertheless confirm earlier evidence that the U.S. aided his killers. A CIA document from 1970 details the role of U.S. intelligence officers in the killing of Schneider, who is regarded as a stumbling block in coup preparations. It reads, "Station met clandestinely evening October 17th with 2 Chilean armed forces officers. They asked that by evening October 18th, Station arranged to furnish them with 8 to 10 tear gas grenades. Within 48 hours, they need 3 .45 caliber machine guns with 500 rounds ammo each." Schneider's son René Jr., 57, said, "Obviously the truth ought to be out. We absolutely know the U.S. government role in financing all that happened before the coup. Anything that brings us closer to the truth is healthy for the country. We still have lots of dark secrets." U.S. officials also revealed a secret intelligence sharing operation which used Nazi groups throughout South America and Europe to track down enemies of the Chilean state. The Latin American German colony known as La Dignidad, or Colonia Dignidad, allowed the Chilean DINA secret police to draw on their national and international contacts and cooperates with DINA officials by turning over to them information on subversives in the area. Friday's release of the documents led to renewed protests that the CIA had refused to follow the spirit of the presidential order. "The U.S. government is skewing this history," said Peter Kornbluh, an investigator for the nonprofit-making National Security Archives. They are not releasing the documents in an attempt to whitewash their own role in fomenting acts of violence in Chile. It has also proved controversial because of the revelation that U.S. intelligence may have played a part in the death of 2 Americans, including the journalist Charles Horman. When the prominent Chilean exile Orlando Letelier was brutally assassinated in Washington, D.C. in September 1976, few investigators of the crime gave a thought to Hitler's SS at the time. Author Glenn Infield writes in Chapter 16 of his 1988 book, Secrets of the SS, South American Reich. When the American expatriate Michael Vernon Townley testified that he had wired Letelier's car with explosives on orders from the chief of Chile's secret police, General Juan Manuel Contreras, the assassination became a political bombshell in the United States. President Carter demanded that Contreras be extradited to the United States to stand trial, and when Chilean President Augusto Pinochet refused, the U.S. ambassador to Chile was recalled, allegedly pushing relations with Chile nearly to the breaking point. However, investigative agencies within the U.S. and of other countries, as they delved deeper into the murder of Letelier, traced the plot back to a secret organization in South America called Operation Condor. Operation Condor, they discovered, is an intelligence-gathering organization that concentrates on leftists around the world, and especially those who are exiled from any of Condor's member countries, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Paraguay. According to a top-secret report issued by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Condor has special teams assigned to travel anywhere in the world to assassinate persons on the Condor hit list. It was then learned through further investigation that the headquarters of Condor was in Chile, and the organization worked very closely with the DINA, the Chilean secret police headed by Contreras. The trial then led to an enclave deep in the foothills of the Chilean Andes south of Santiago, an enclave known as the Colony to outsiders, but officially named Colonia Dignidad, translation, Dignity Colony, by the Chilean government. Regardless of what name it is called, the secret colony is actually a Nazi stronghold that is protected by the Chilean government and which works very closely with the DINA. Informed sources within the Chilean government state that one of the responsibilities of the ex-Gestapo and ex-SS officers at Colonia Dignidad is to demonstrate Nazi torture methods for the Chilean secret police and to instruct the DINA in such brutality. These sources verified that there is a detention camp for Chilean political prisoners within the colony. Colonia Dignidad was established in Chile in 1961 by German ex-Luftwaffe officer Paul Schaefer. He began his organization shortly after World War II in Holporf, Germany, then moved it to Siegburg, a town near Bonn. Schaefer guaranteed the defeated German citizens both the spiritual and material needs they craved during these harsh post-war years. He also promised anonymity to those Germans who joined his group. This was a powerful lure for many of the SS men on the run from Allied investigators. They quickly joined Schaefer, and when he moved the entire organization from Germany to Chile in 1961, his SS membership was pleased, since South America was known to be a safe haven for unreconstructed Nazis. The reason for the move to Chile has never been verified, but it is thought that Schaefer was guaranteed complete independence for his colony by the Chilean government. In return, Schaefer's SS men were to train the Chilean secret police. During the same period, ex-SS officers and German military personnel were being hired by Argentina, Egypt, and many other countries for the same purpose. According to one investigator, Charles Kraus, it is not even permissible to take a photograph of the front gate of the enclave. I was threatened with arrest by police, who finally took from me an undeveloped roll of film with pictures of Dignidad's entrance, taken from outside its gates. The police, who wore no identification badges, would only say that they were from a small town about 20 miles to the west and that they were acting on orders from Santiago. He did learn that the colony has its own airstrip, its own fleet of aircraft, and a private communications system. The elaborate communications system permits Schaefer and his colleagues to keep in radio contact with a mother house in Siegburg and with a mansion in Santiago that is filled with modern electronic communications equipment. The entire 15,000-acre enclave is enclosed by a high barbed wire fence, and citizens of the area say it is the place where nobody comes and nobody goes. Proximity of the Argentine border and the private airstrip and fleet of planes makes it easy for inhabitants of the colony to leave and return without any normal customs formalities. It makes an ideal secret hideout for Nazis on the run. Both the FBI and Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter, state they have evidence that such fugitives as Dr. Joseph Mengele, the Third Reich's angel of death, have spent time at Colonia Dignidad. There is also evidence that Schaefer is in contact with pro-Nazi groups around the world and that large amounts of money are sent to Colonia Dignidad each year by such groups. The saying that nobody comes and nobody goes at Colonia Dignidad applies only to the regular members of the enclave, not the leadership. When called upon, the ex-SS men of the colony are not reluctant to go any place in the world to help their former SS and Nazi comrades. One such mission in 1977 nearly brought down the government of Italy. Herbert Kappler, a former SS colonel who was serving a life sentence for ordering the execution of 335 Italian civilians in German-occupied Rome in 1944, appealed for release from prison 33 years later for humanitarian reasons. He had been hospitalized for several months for the treatment of stomach cancer. His appeal, however, was turned down by the highest court in Italy, so the fraternity of ex-SS men decided to take matters into their own hands. According to the periodical Bild am Sonntag of Bonn, there is no doubt about who was involved. The flight was planned and prepared by former members of the SS. One of them was an officer of the SS security service in Rome during the war. 3 of the ex-SS officers involved in the escape came from Colonia Dignidad. In truth, no one knows how many people were killed inside Colonia Dignidad, writes Bruce Falconer, author of The Torture Colony. One former colonos recently told Chilean government investigators that, on Schaefer's orders, he once drove a busload of 35 political prisoners up into the colonia's wooded hills and left them in an isolated spot by the side of a dirt road. As he drove back down alone, he heard machine gun fire echoing through the forest. No bodies were ever recovered. According to at least one former high-ranking colonos, bodies of executed prisoners were exhumed in 1978, burned to ash, and dumped in the river. Others claimed that the dead were buried in individual graves scattered about the hills and valleys. All that seems certain is that many of the prisoners who went into Colonia Dignidad were never seen again. Over the years, there have been numerous attempts to investigate Colonia Dignidad, most compromised from the start by Schaefer's network of protectors within the Chilean political and judicial establishment. In 1968, the Chilean government sent a parliamentary delegation to investigate Wolfgang Mueller's accusation that he had been tortured there. Schaefer entertained the politicians with children's choirs and gourmet food, and the delegation ultimately determined, after minimal deliberation, that Mueller's allegations were unfounded. Later, in 1982, the German government, following evidence collected by Amnesty International, issued a request to the Pinochet government for cooperation in a joint investigation of Schaefer's community. The request was denied, as were 2 others in 1985 and 1988. Only after Pinochet left power in 1990 did Schaefer's support system begin to collapse. The new government, headed by Patricio Aylwin, a former senator and longtime opponent of Paul Schaefer, revoked the Colonia's status as a nonprofit charitable organization, cut off state funding for the hospital, and initiated a financial audit of the colony's businesses. The colonos fought back with protest rallies and hunger strikes. Despite the growing public controversy, little changed inside Colonia Dignidad. Schaefer carried on without interruption. He launched a new educational initiative called the Intensive Boarding School, a kind of immersion program in which select local Chilean students were invited to live, work, and study in the Colonia until they reached the age of 18. Local families proved eager to participate. The program seemed like a good thing, at least to the parents, until in the winter of 1996, a 12-year-old student named Cristobal Parada smuggled a secret note to his mother. He wrote, "Take me out of here. He raped me." She managed to rescue him at considerable risk to Cristobal and herself, and drove him to a nearby medical clinic where a physician verified that the boy had been raped. Cristobal's mother feared that the local police would be of no use, or worse, that they would return her son to the Germans. She fled with Cristobal to the anonymity of the capital, where she sought out the chief of Chile's National Detective Force, a man named Luis Enriquez. Proud and seasoned professional, Enriquez had, in his 25 years on the force, been exposed to the darker aspects of human nature. In the early 1970s, he had served as one of Allende's bodyguards and was there, inside the presidential palace, when Allende had committed suicide. In a country rife with conspiracies, Enriquez held a rigid belief in facts. The truth has only one version, he liked to say. There are no different truths. His was an unsophisticated view of the world, but notably, one uncorrupted by Schaefer's influence. In mid-August 1996, a judge in Santiago issued a warrant for Schaefer's arrest on charges of child abuse, asking Enriquez to execute it. Inside the Colonia that summer, life went on as before. The investigation taking form in far-off Santiago remained invisible to Schaefer and his followers. Local children continued to visit on weekends and holidays. The intensive boarding school remained in session, and by all accounts, Schaefer continued to enjoy the sexual pleasures of his group of young boys he called his sprinters. The pattern was interrupted only when word of the arrest warrant reached Schaefer and his lieutenants. A meeting was called on August 20th, 1996 to discuss what should be done. Schaefer seemed badly shaken. As the colonos discussed how to proceed, he kept his head down and never spoke a word. Shortly thereafter, he disappeared into the Colonia's network of subterranean bunkers and tunnels. It is widely believed that he was there, underground, when on November 30th, 1996, Enriquez muscled his way into Schaefer's utopia for the first time. Enriquez had hoped to capture Schaefer by surprise. He went in with 30 armed policemen in a caravan, but as his team made its way up the long dirt road, it was spotted by the Colonia's lookouts, who gave warning. The caravan busted through a sequence of gates and only slowed as it approached the village itself. Enriquez had given orders to his men, should they come under fire, not to retreat, but to move deeper into the village for cover. To his surprise, resistance was minimal. The colonos were like zombies, or maybe like robots, Enriquez would later recall. They were machines. On, off, on, off, on, off. They didn't change moods like normal people. Though Schaefer's followers were generally subdued, at times they became aggressive, and in a few cases, they physically assaulted the police. Enriquez assumed these outbursts signaled that they were getting close to Schaefer, but in the end, Enriquez and his police went home empty-handed. Over the years, Enriquez conducted more than 30 raids on the Colonia, always with the same goal in mind: to capture Paul Schaefer. Theories abounded as to where he might be. The colonists insisted he was dead. Others claimed he was hiding in the underground tunnels. Still others were convinced he had fled the country. Henriquez came to believe that Schaefer remained in the Colonia for some time after that initial raid. I have no doubt, he told me, that sometimes we were just seconds from catching him. Journalist John Dingus even suggested that there was at least some degree of cooperation between the German intelligence service, German arms dealer Gerhard Mertens, and Colonia Dignidad, including the creation of the bunkers, tunnels, a state-of-the-art hospital with underground soundproof torture chambers, and runways for the decentralized production of armaments in modules. Citing an article sourced from the Historical Research Archive at williambranham.org, originally published June 2, 2005, between Tuesday and Wednesday of last week, while the compound was being raided, the Chilean authorities found on the Colonia's premises, in addition to 3 arms depots, the secret files of the Colonia Dignidad. According to sources of the investigation, in several folders, there were about 500 files of various political leaders and artists, as well as records of people who disappeared during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet between 1973 and 1990. One of these files had been given the name John F. Kennedy, and inside were 2 bullets of the same caliber that had allegedly been used in the assassination of JFK. The arsenal included dozens of surface-to-air missiles, rocket launchers, submachine guns, hand and cluster grenades, rifles, anti-personnel mines, automatic pistols, and a large amount of ammunition. As the investigation continued, officials even discovered weaponized sarin gas and revealed that the cult compound had indeed been manufacturing chemical and biological weapons. In the end, by 1996, Paul Schaefer fled child sexual abuse charges in Chile, escaping arrest until 2005. A Chilean court had convicted him of child abuse in his absence the previous year, along with 26 other members of the cult. After being sentenced to 20 years, he would die in prison of a heart ailment April 24, 2010, at the age of 88. Colonia Dignidad was a state-sponsored operation, facilitated by the unethical whims of operators within the cult of intelligence. Today, we remain vigilant in our staunch obligation to challenge the prevailing narrative. Yet another tale of historical revisionism, intrinsically conflicting with the duplicitous version of recorded history. It's time we remove the veil and bear witness to the nefarious nature of the permanent war state. No longer can we afford to embrace this false reality. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote so long ago in his essay titled History in 1841, time dissipates to shining ether the solid angularity of facts. No anchor, no cable, no fences avail to keep a fact a fact. Babylon and Troy and even early Rome are passing already into fiction. The Garden of Eden, the sun standing still in Gibeon, is poetry thenceforward to all nations. Who cares what the fact was, when we have thus made a constellation of it to hang in heaven an immortal sign? London, Paris, and New York must go the same way. What is history, said Napoleon, but a fable agreed upon?